Okay, testing 1, 2, 3. It is 11:30 and everybody is getting their lunches prepared, so we apologize for the background noise, but out of the respect for people's time, we'll begin our meeting. And if it's okay, Jim, I don't know if you've started your lunch yet, but we'll call on you first. The agenda items, we have 3 items on the agenda, and the first one is the public parking analysis with Jim Gilmore, Director of Strategic Planning and Research. And we have a little map, if everybody's got that, of the different parking sites. And if not, we'll try to get that up so you can see that too, and we can pass one around. Go ahead, Jim.
Okay, thank you. I think I went through some of this information before, but I thought I could go through it in some greater detail. There's a map that we'd had at a previous meeting. I think you know where most of these facilities are, but I think this map helps provide an image of not only where these facilities are, and I don't have counts, but there's also a tremendous amount of on-street parking throughout the downtown and some other private facilities that are typically empty in the nights and weekends, such as, Gate City Bank. They have a spot there, but let me just kind of go through these facilities, and I think our target for the number needed, if we have.
Sorry, did you have additional copies?
Where is it coming on the screen?
They're over there. Why don't we get those?
Could I ask everybody a favor? Could you turn off your microphone if you're eating potato chips? That was just from the sake of it. Thank you.
What I think our goal or the expectation was, we find 800 parking spots in relatively close proximity to this Civic Center site. That being the idea that on average there'd be 1 car for every 3 people who would be attending events. I think that's what a lot of facility planners use. And so I'll just go through these facilities and my estimates on a number of parking spots that would likely be available, again, nights and weekends. The first is the Civic Center ramp. That facility is a 250-car spot. There's 150 hotel rooms in Radisson, and we have an agreement with the Radisson to guarantee them 150 overnight spots, and so we have to make sure those are all available for the hotel guests. So that would leave to 100 spots that would typically be available, or at least 100 in that facility. The Block 9 garage will have 379 parking spots. Our agreement with the Block 9 partners is that at least 200 of those spots would be available nights and weekends for the public. They would be on nights where we're charging for parking in the Civic Center ramp. They would also charge for parking. If we're not charging for parking, then they have to provide free parking. So the 379 spots, they have to have at least 200 available. When they are charging, the city would receive 50% of that revenue per the terms of our agreements. The Roberts Commons garage, that's a 454 spot facility. I'm estimating there'd be 200 available. There's probably 250 apartments attached to that building, either in Roberts Commons building or the Dillard building to the north. So assuming 1 car per resident, we would think that there might be up to 250 spots of it being used by overnight residents. The GTC garage, it's 185 parking spots. There's very little use in the evening. There's a few residential units that rent spots, so I'm estimating 150 would be available there. There's the City Center surface parking lot. That's the one that's, if you can look to the north here, there's a condominium building going up. There's a surface lot immediately to the west with 111 spots. There'd likely be a few fleet vehicles in that spot, but I think at least 100 would be available. There's the proposed mercantile parking facility. So actually, even without the mercantile, we're up to about 750 available spots. The proposed mercantile is going to be about 370 spots. We estimate 170 of those would be apartment renters, either in the mercantile building or adjacent building. So there'd be 200 available in the evening. So that would bring us up to 950. In addition, there's, I kind of look at this as being sort of event staff parking, because you would need some sort of a key fob to be able to get into it. At City Hall, we have at least 80 spots underground. Again, there's some fleet vehicles down there, but we estimate there'd be at least 50 available. So if you have event staff, you could have them have badges and they could get in, so that would take the pressure off of other parking in the vicinity. And then under City Center, we have 110 spots. Again, there'd probably be about 50 fleet vehicles, engineering inspection vehicles that are there nights and weekends, but another 60 spaces. So you could have up to 110 spots for people that you'd want to give passes to, our staff. We could get them out of the way. So, there's some other private lots in the area that I haven't tried to include in this. And when you start to count up on-street parking spots, it probably gets into the hundreds more parking. So this particular site, I think parking seems to be adequate given all these facilities. It's how we manage them. So be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Linda. And Brad. Let Linda go first, then Brad.
Thank you. This looks encouraging. Quick question. Since you have recently studied the issue because of building this facility, how much, like a big fat round number, does adding underground parking to a major structure add to the cost? If we're talking 10, 20 million, or just big fat number, just to know.
Probably defer maybe the architects. Probably it depends on if you're going to expect to run into a lot of rubble and how your foundation works. I mean, sometimes it's less expensive than, say, a structure. We're looking around $30,000 a spot. If you're going to build a basement anyway, and the footings and all that shoring, maybe you can get it for 20. However, if there's a lot of rubble and it makes your with all the HVAC systems, maybe you're up to 40,000 parking spots. So I'm not sure what it added, here to add that spots, but I think City Center is probably pretty close to the 30,000 that we're paying for structured parking somewhere else. I don't have those numbers. I don't, Kent, if you would recall that. And
if I could add, the one thing that we are anticipating with this new facility, that there would be storage in the lower level. One of the things is this, if we have movable seating, so there would be the possibility of moving that either to the lower level or doing something like that. So I don't know if the possibility for parking is going to be that likely, because I think it's more than likely going to be used for storage or for other support services. I don't know if that makes sense, Rob, if you have anything to add, but that was kind of what we had conceptualized at the beginning, I think.
Yeah, I think with the initial stuff, it was, there may be a bit of a lower level, but it's storage underneath the main area, plus depending upon overall building footprint needs, that offices or other stuff could be.
Right. I think I'd remembered that would be kind of a higher use for that space. I just wanted to, while we're talking about parking, I just wanted to get that out of there to remind us that if people ask, this is why we're studying this and not thinking of adding underground parking, because that will be used for part of the program of the building.
Brad, did you want
You know, I've identified 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lots that probably have anywhere from 75 surface lots that have cars in them, and I'm guessing all those are empty at night. So those individuals, they're probably privately owned, could open those up to $5 parking or something during an event.
Yeah, I think, Gate City Bank, their lots
Yep.
open. I believe they allow people to use it in the evening after 5 o'clock. Many of the parking lots,
The Form lot.
in behind the Dakota Building, there's some spots. We have other surface lots a little further away, but these are all a little bit closer.
Yeah, it looks encouraging.
So the ramp at the Radisson, the, is it feasible at all to retrofit that or to, it looks like for the same sort of, at least size, there's about a third more spaces in all of these other facilities. I mean, is it feasible to tear it down and build something new or to?
Probably not to tear it down and build new, but it was built with the capacity to put another level on it. So we potentially could put another 70 parking spots by going up one more level. We haven't analyzed that in great detail. Building codes have changed and ADA has changed a little bit. But that's a possibility. As we look at new facilities, it's generally going to be more cost effective to put another level on something new than to go back and retrofit. However, that's such an excellent location tied to the Skyway, it may be, feasible at some point. It'd probably cost you at least $40,000 a parking stall to put, that, something else on top of that, so it'd be another $3 million.
Mr. Chairman, so is there some kind of industry standard for how many people per car usually attend events? Is there?
Not really an industry standard, but what we see over our 25-plus years of operation for
I'm sorry?
concerts, things such as that, it's 2 to 3 on average per car that come through.
So when you're talking availability here, Jim, you're talking about spots that are in competition for activities that are going on normally in downtown. Is that right? I'm assuming?
Only on nights and weekends, so there's certain, use at nights and weekends. I don't think any of these facilities fill up nights and weekends
Okay.
right now, so.
Is there some reason you didn't include the Main Avenue ramp? Is it too far away, or?
I think that's a little too far away. We have a hard time getting people to use that and even walk into the core of the downtown, but
So if we did some shuttling or something?
you could do
might
some
be
shuttling
possible,
from that.
yeah.
That's another 350 parking spots, so.
Are there any other questions? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next item on the agenda. Is that all right? So the next item is, and Kent, I don't know if you're ready. Okay, number 2 is Performing Arts Center Capital Financing Review with Kent. And it's, we've got kind of a handout with all the information in there.
Thank you, Dave, and thanks for the opportunity to present this information. I hope this doesn't come off as being overly technical, but this is my world and how we go about financing things. Sometimes there's different ways and means of getting there, and I just wanted to at least educate the group on the structure of certain kinds of debt and just kind of keeping that in the back of your mind. So with that, page 2. Tax exempt financing, and basically, again, because we're a municipal not-for-profit corporation, we can issue tax exempt bonds under certain circumstances. We'll get into some of the nuances in the later slides, but generally speaking, we provide very low, the lowest possible interest rates. We have a high demand for our bonds because of the strength of our credit rating and how the city's managed. And it basically, the bonds issued are typically backed by the city's financial stability in one method or another. And I want to walk you through some of that methodology so you understand that. Debt options available, and there's 3 that we have used from time to time. We haven't issued a lot of general obligation bonds. When people talk about cities issuing bonds, they often talk about general obligation bonds. That's the purest form of municipal bonds that you can issue because it's backed by the full faith and credit of the city of Fargo and your ability to issue, or excuse me, to levy property taxes in the event that you're having trouble meeting your debt obligations. And I'll run through the advantages on subsequent slides. Revenue debt is similar, but it may be backed by cash reserves and other dedicated revenues. And in this case, we haven't talked much about revenue streams, so I don't have much to share other than that revenue is a little bit more expensive revenue debt than the other two. Annual appropriation bonds or debt is backed simply by a promise to repay the bondholders. There's no guarantee, no backing other than your promise to pay the bondholders. There would really be adverse impacts on the city's ability to issue future debt if you ever defaulted on one of these. So it acts much like a general obligation. It just doesn't have the legal hooks in it that you're not required to levy taxes in the event of a default. This may be getting down in the weeds a little bit. The city hasn't issued a lot of general obligation debt. We issued that recently for City Hall because that was what we felt is almost the purest form of government essential facilities. So we issued general obligation debt for that. And as well, we issued some general obligation debt for the ROCO ramp, simply because it was in a development district. So there are some capacity constraints, and in the middle of this, it says current capacity already consumed. We've used about 55 million of the $237 million capacity, so we bonded 23% of our capacity. Now, this is linked to the growth in our tax base, and as our tax base continues to grow, so does our ability to reach out and use general obligation debt. It probably looks a little odd just regard to timing that 23% isn't a huge margin, but to the extent we hadn't used it in the past, it's like, well, okay, what's a reasonable amount? And again, it's all dependent upon what the needs of your community are, and if you have a decision to back it with GO bonds. Generally requires, under the North Dakota Century Code, it generally does require a vote of the public to issue GO debt. And in the case of a development district or a renewal district, there's a nuance in the law that if you're in a renewal district, a downtown development district, you can issue a general obligation without a public vote. There's a bit of a reverse referendum procedure that you have to run through, which takes a fairly significant protest to prohibit the public from saying no to that project. And under GO, it's limited to 20-year amortization, so it's a little faster than what I'll show you. And feel free to jump in with questions. I would want this to be a little bit of a dialogue. If you do have something, we certainly would try to answer that. And again, general obligation does provide the lowest possible interest rates because it is secured by full faith and credit of the city.
You did issue this for ROCO?
Yes,
So
for
that
the
was a
city
public,
and for ROCO.
public-private partnership
Yep,
type of structure?
yes.
So can't the renewal district, is that the Renaissance zone, or what is the renewal district?
Jim might have to help me with that, but a renewal district is basically just a targeted area, and we did create, I think it was called the Riverfront Development District a couple years ago. It's not a tax increment district, it's just a designation of this is where we're likely to do urban renewal, and Jim helped me with this a little bit. I think moving forward, we would anticipate we'd be issuing or adding tax increment financing on certain projects.
Yeah, typically you've seen these renewal plans then go in conjunction with the tax increment financing district, and that's what we did with the Roberts Commons development. There's a TIF district that allows us to create or capture increment, but the renewal plans would allow us to sell GO bonds instead of other types of revenue bonds. With City Hall, we created a renewal plan or renewal district, without a TIF district, and then that simply allowed us to issue GO bonds without having the public vote. As Kent noted, there is sort of a protest period where if, I forget, it's a relatively high percentage of people in the city all band together and sign something, they can put it to a public vote, but it'd be very difficult to accomplish.
Other questions?
Because the new city hall was approved by vote, wasn't it?
No, it wasn't. We used the development district in the reverse referendum procedure. And just for the sake of the committee, the referendum, reverse referendum procedure is simply publish a notice in the paper to say that you're anticipating the issuance of bonds, and if you want to protest, you have to meet a certain bar, if you will. I don't have that committed to memory because we've only done it once, but it's a significant hurdle, actually, with regard to a protest. But you do make the community aware. And again, that's all governed by state law.
Any other questions? It's all good information, and I do think, we talked a little bit about this earlier, but as a commission, you have to be very careful about how much debt that you assume. You know, there's things that can happen and so I think we've done a good job, and obviously there are previous commissioners here that we haven't been overextended in using borrowing power to do too much, because I think you have to be careful about that. So I don't know if anybody has any questions or comments about it.
Dave, yeah, and I think the other thing that's important is, and you've alluded to it, yeah, do you go to a vote? Do you not go to a vote? What's politically correct? What will the city tolerate? And I think you're kind of dancing that line to figure out what's the best way to finance something like this without, with getting the approval of the city.
If not, I'll continue. Revenue debt, I won't talk much about this because, again, we don't really have a revenue stream at this point, but it is an option. As a point of reference on past examples, we used revenue debt for sales tax revenue bonds for the Fargo Dome construction. That was many years ago. That's run its term. And now Rob is sitting on a treasure trove of surplus that had been generated from the sales tax residual. And again, that was governed by the original ordinance that was established and voted on by the people about how we conducted our business at the time we created the dome. We also have issued sales tax revenue bonds to flood some flood control projects as well, because we do have dedicated sales tax for infrastructure. Annual appropriation debt, again, I mentioned earlier, this is just simply backed by a promise to repay. One of the advantages, the third bullet point, is you can use a longer amortization period. In the state law, you can go up to 25 years. There's no requirement for a public vote. And in the past, we have used this type of debt for the video projects and video boards up at the Fargo Dome. That was what, about a $7 to $8 million project? The jumbotrons and the scoreboard and all of that, that was done that way.
Are there any currently in this category?
Yes, I think we have some annual appropriation debt outstanding. I'm struggling with just exactly what that is, but you've stumped me. So those are the three kind of debt issuance opportunities. There are some, I reached out to our bond counsel, there are some special compliance procedures that have to be dealt with, and whenever there's an issuance of tax-exempt debt, you have to evaluate if there's a private use, in other words, a non-governmental entity that's using the facility that's financed with tax-exempt debt. And there are certain rules in place that if they become a major consumer of this and they have a benefit, that you may have to issue, instead of the called tax-exempt bonds, you would issue taxable bonds, which just simply means that the bondholder has to pay tax on those bonds as opposed to getting the tax-free privilege. I didn't dive real deep into this, but bottom line, the bond counsel suggested that if you are going to go after a donation or a major campaign, fundraising campaign, that you need to be careful about declaring that you have that and what the magnitude of that is. And then in the end, is that enough to make you issue taxable debt versus tax-exempt debt? And I just wanted to say that because it has to do with the structuring of any debt that would be issued. You need to kind of know in advance what the plan is for any major fundraising. Linda.
Just to put this question out there, can one use two types of debt for a single facility, like a portion of it, an annual appropriation debt, and a portion of it, revenue-backed debt?
I think the answer is yes, and what you would probably have to do would carve out and measure, you know, the exposure to that. I don't know the specific rules because we have not done that before. Typically it goes if you exceed the threshold for issuance of tax-exempt debt, then you just issue taxables. Again, bond counsel would have to help answer that. Haven't.
Yeah, I didn't know, I didn't mean to refer to those two, tax exempt and taxable. I was referring to the three types of bonding, so like a revenue-backed, like a dedicated sales tax, say.
Yeah, I understand. I
and-
think the answer is yes. We can put together whatever financing plan works. And again, about the fundraising, it's important to know the structure of that, or at least the goal, as we would move forward with that. This is just a point of reference, and again, these are major facilities on this page: Fargo Dome Library, City Hall, the Rocco Ramp, and the magnitude of the projects that we did, and then the funding sources. Obviously, the first two were voter-approved sales tax. One of them we bonded, which was the Fargo Dome, and over a 20-year term. And the library, in the case of that, that was, Linda, I think you're aware of that one, that was a sales tax, and we just simply collected the money monthly and paid the bills monthly, and after 18 months, we shut it off. And that, we got to the goal line just in time, so that one was well structured. City Hall, again, that was general obligation bond, I mentioned that already. That's a direct obligation then of the general fund to pay that. So in other words, that competes with our operating budgets that are approved annually, with salaries and wages and operating supplies and any other capital type items we need for the rest of the city. Questions on that? This is the interesting part, I think, and thanks to the consultants that helped us compile this information. We asked them to reach out to the data and look at how other people have financed or funded various facilities. And I don't know that I necessarily wanted to go through all of them. You can read what they have done. In most cases, it appears they've kind of cobbled together new revenue streams, appropriations from state or local entities. In the case of that Appleton one, in the middle, 14 communities dedicated a certain amount of hotel tax. That was quite a collaboration, it appears, there, and others committed that. In the case of Durham, 2,700 seats, looks much like they just stepped up to the plate and issued debt and had a smaller level of donations. And then others have had some state and other type of things. In Sioux Falls, probably our closest one, we have a 1% entertainment tax to pay the bonds. The city contributes $1.2 million towards the operations. They have some grants, and the city pays for all the capital improvements. So again, there's some pressure on municipal operations under that model. So this is just for the sake of illustration that we'll have to decide what type of approach you want to use to fund and finance this long term, because it certainly is a significant obligation. And Jim and Mike had commented in Federal Way how they $32 million for 700 seats. That seemed like kind of a pricey alternative, but again, I don't know what the dates or the time or what years these were. It's probably irrelevant. The point of it is that you have to have resources to be able to pay that debt obligation.
Can I just add, thank you very much, because I think this is very valuable information, because a lot of it, hopefully we can copy the good ideas from all these different venues, because if you look, there's little pieces of all these different that kind of fit for us. To give you an example, like the land, let's say that we use the civic site, well, that's the city land, and so that would be part of the contribution that the city would make, would be the land for the location. So I think, to me, this is the most valuable part of the presentation, even though it's all been a wonderful presentation. But I think there's a lot of ideas that we can hopefully use here to help us with our projects.
So I'll give you a few minutes to digest that if you want, but or if there's questions about it. Again, it's all in. Mike, did you have a comment?
Ken, I was just going to ask if you can go back one slide to Appleton. Appleton was an intriguing one as we looked at that, that was an example of a significant amount of fundraising that had occurred in that community, but also several cities that were pledging their own individual hotel taxes. and then an ongoing city commitment on its 1% of its lodging tax. I just thought that was an intriguing one, and that's on my list to do a little bit of follow-up with Appleton. It's sort of in our market. And then the other one that struck me was Richmond. When we looked at that, nice size facility, about 80,000 square feet. It's smaller than what we're talking about here, much more expensive facility, but in that case, there's also some state funds that came into the deal as well as city money and private sources. But I think just the other comment I was going to make is that it would appear in just this kind of high-level summary that JLG has provided that private fundraising, private capital is an integral and necessary component of all of these deals in some fashion or another. And it's in some of these per seat costs of construction are significant, but it also is not shocking to see some of their numbers compared to what we're seeing as well, even on our 2015 analysis of what we thought it would take to construct. So it was good. I think this is a nice exercise, and I agree with Chair Pepcorn that this is really valuable for us for the future, not just today, but in the future, just to kind of think about how others have done it.
Kent, I'm just curious, with these, I'm wondering how old these are. You know, at some point, how long ago did they do that? But more importantly, I'm wondering how sustainable are these projects, and are these communities meeting with success, or are they seeing growth in their operational use, or what trends I'd be just curious what flags they're getting.
Yeah, basically at this point, we just compiled the structure of that. That's certainly a valid question. We might have to defer to the consultants to maybe reach out to them if you're interested in obtaining that data. I mean, we toured Sioux Falls 3 years ago, and that entertainment venue was kind of the heart and soul of the city. Charlie, I think you were with on that trip, weren't you?
The age of each of these is in the existing report that you would have as far as their ongoing operational. I don't think they have that data in there.
Can I ask a question? Maybe it's for Rob or somebody else, but is it ever possible where you have an additional fee on tickets so the actual users pay for part of the facility, or is that never, does that ever
It's definitely
happen?
a revenue stream, a facility fee. Fargo Dome has it. Most facilities have it. Most performance centers have it. Most everyone has it. It's another revenue source. It's just how is it the financing setup or the financial setup, whether that goes to debt service, whether that goes to a capital plan, capital improvement plan, whether that goes to just your annual operating, considered part of your operating revenue.
Charlie.
I'm looking at the general obligation debt here, Kent. Generally requires a vote of the public to issue GO debt. However, North Dakota Century Code doesn't require that. Is that what you're saying in this?
No, I'm saying it does require it unless you're in a development district.
Okay, but so if we were considered to be in a development district
Yes.
here, then you wouldn't have to.
Yes.
But then the question becomes, the city can issue this debt up to $238 million practically, but theoretically, you'd want to be able to show people that you had the funds to cover it, so there wasn't going to be like a property tax increase to come along and.
Ideally, you should have a revenue stream that matches that
Yeah.
perfectly with a little bit of coverage on the revenue side so that you weren't constrained or fall into a dip where you'd have to then appropriate a large payment.
So even for a GO debt, you'd want to have a revenue stream set up somewhere.
Well, it'd be ideal because I'll show you the magnitude then. At the last slides kind of help with the magnitude if you wanted to go there right now.
Sure.
Okay. So we ran some numbers, and again, the footnotes are on the bottom. We just simply assumed a $60 million cost estimate. I think that is in the ballpark from at least past discussions. I'm not sure if flowing forward. But if you look at the general obligation, 20-year amortizations, the magnitude of the debt payment straight up with no fundraising is about $3.9 million. If you had a significant fundraising, and we would consider significant to be at least 50%, that has been politically vetted in some regard from some of the feedback from commissioners or a commissioner. So that's 1.9 million. And then as you ratchet down, if you did less fundraising, then obviously your debt payment goes up. The annual appropriation debt here in the case would be 25-year debt, like I said earlier. And if you compare that to the top line, you can see the advantage of using the annual appropriation debt because you're spreading it out 5 more years. The payment is 3.4 or 3.5 versus 3.9. So there is some advantage, at least to the annual payment. Down below on the bottom, I also reached out to our bonding consultants, Baker Tilly. They provided current estimates of what the interest rates were, because somebody had asked, it's like, okay, if we would intend to use the annual appropriation type of debt, is this a significant difference or just a minor difference? And under the current market rates right now, the GO debt's at about 2.75 and annual appropriation is at 3.3. So it is marginally higher, but again, it's the difference between having a tax base protect the bondholders' interest versus just a promise. So the market compensates for that. So, so those are some examples.
And Kent, that doesn't include operational costs, or you're just talking the cost of the construction?
Yeah, this is just
financing
simply
that.
the capital cost to construct the facility, and then using some form of financing to pay that over whatever term.
Just a gauge, our general fund budget's 91 million now plus?
Yeah, it'll be close to 100 million this year.
Okay, so we see what this would look like relative to our budget.
Yeah, yep. And that was the point of illustrating it this way, is so you can get your sense of what's the magnitude and what's the need to have a fundraising campaign. So that's to the next slide, a need for a major fundraising campaign or creation of a new revenue stream. Others have talked about hotel or lodging taxes or some other form of dedicated tax. You know, in the case, you know, you probably could even throw out the idea of a sales tax. That hasn't been discussed, but those are the ones at least we'd have the authority to consummate under certain parameters. And then again, prioritization of this project with other city capital projects and then the impact on the city budget certainly is something that the commissioners need to be cognizant of to make sure that we're not on a 25-year subsidy plan and that we have a sound financial plan for paying for it.
As long as you brought it up, just out of curiosity, what does a half-cent sales tax in Fargo raise now annually?
I believe it's about 14 million per year.
So a quarter cent would be like 7+ million.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman? So, Kent, the City Hall GO bond, what revenue stream was dedicated for that?
Basically, the city's budget.
Okay.
We absorbed that, and I believe that was, I think it was about a $1.7 million debt payment. I didn't illustrate that in my slides, but yeah, you're right. We anticipated that we could absorb that, and we are currently absorbing that as we finish this off and as we move towards making those payments. But again, it's all within trying to balance that whole general.
So this is more of a technical question. Would that not be an annual appropriation fund if you don't have a dedicated revenue stream, or?
Well, but we didn't levy any additional taxes for it.
Okay.
That would be the difference. We took it into the general fund budget and we absorbed it with our normal growth in our tax base. We didn't dedicate any new mill levy to pay for that. In the case of the City Hall, at 1.7 million, that would have been about 3 dedicated tax mills to cover that payment. We didn't raise taxes.
To ask, but what is the lowest increment of a penny that you can raise taxes on? Can you go to 1/8 of a cent? Or is
Say that again, I didn't hear you.
What's the lowest increment of a penny that you can, sales
For
tax?
sales tax? Well, I would imagine you could model it around just about anything.
I mean,
It's an interesting question. Could you wrap it around this debt obligation? I would suspect so.
like could you go to 1/8 of a penny?
Or a quarter?
Oh, yeah.
Or, I
Yeah,
mean-
whatever the proposal would be.
So quarter cent isn't the smallest increment.
No, those are just examples of what we've used in the past.
Right, right.
And I think that's more art than science
Sure.
when you start talking about term of paying for it and how long the facility lasts and that type of thing.
But those do have to go to a vote.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, at some point, I'm assuming we'll be able to see current sales tax, food and lodging tax, and see when they're expiring. Will that be coming at some point?
There's currently no food and beverage tax in Fargo. The lodging tax is dedicated for tourism, and currently a third of it we use for a capital fund, which we've used for a bunch of different projects. But, you know, the question is, can you increase the lodging tax? Do you need state enabling legislation to do that? Because the current state legislation designates 3%, also designates 1% for food and beverage, and I think 1% for rental car. And we don't have either the food and beverage or the rental car right now in place. But I think there's some research being done to determine if, according to state statute, those two could be put on without a vote of the people, but there's some question as to whether local referenda had caused those to be subject to a vote. So I think the city attorney's looking into that.
I think Eric had looked at least into the restaurant, the food and beverage tax, and that one you could put on without a vote of the people because it's got a separate definition from sales tax. We have local ordinances that say that sales tax has to be to a vote of the people, but this food and restaurant tax, he didn't think needed to be, but unless you've heard something different.
I talked to Eric last night. He's waffling on those. He's seeking some more guidance from the state.
And we are one of the only cities in North Dakota of any size that does not have the restaurant tax. Virtually every other city
I know
does.
many that do. I don't have a count.
When you look through the list, it's kind of amazing. And I know that there is 2% for lodging and then an additional 1%. Are you at 2 or at 3? We're at 3. You're at 3.
We're at 3.
So that
2% goes to operating and 1% is for designated primarily for capital things.
So the remaining one out, the untapped revenue source out there would be the restaurant,
food and beverage,
and rental car.
Food and beverage, I think Kent, we figured would raise $3 to $3.5 million a year, somewhere in that.
Yeah, I haven't been really involved in those analyses, so I'm not familiar with the numbers, but.
Well, a few years ago, I got that from you, so.
Wow.
And that was a few years ago.
That was a few years ago.
I don't think it's gone down.
And I'm of the belief that if you can keep that total to less than 7.5%, there probably is room to add a quarter or something with the sales tax. If it would jump over that, I don't think you'd have a prayer at a vote for a sales tax, unless it would keep it below or right now with the diversion, I don't think the sales tax
We're
would.
at 7.5% right now, aren't we?
Right, and I don't know if
Not
anything
including the
opens
paid.
up in the next 2, 3, 4 years. I'm not sure. Like you said, the schedule would be nice to see what the layering of it is.
I've just assumed it's all spoken for.
Yeah, the next authorization expires in 2028, and I believe the city would be seeking an extension of that because it's all dedicated for infrastructure, so. Unless you expanded the use for municipal facilities, but then that's a different story.
The other advantage to the restaurant tax is that it doesn't expire. It's just put in place and it's there in perpetuity. And it also has the advantage of it's not levied on all purchases. You know, it's a choice to go out to eat. So it's a little better sell. It's just not adding to that total sales tax burden for a family.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that, but it's going to be a harder sell than a lodging tax because lodging tax, you can argue, is paid for primarily by visitors to the community, whereas food and beverage, obviously, a big chunk of it's paid by local people. I don't mean to be cavalier about this, but I don't think most of us who go out and eat would notice that 1% that much. But, you know, there'll be questions about it.
So that was the end of the presentation. If there's any other questions, we'd be happy to answer them. Commissioner Strand, was that a request? Did we follow up on the dates and times of when they implemented these and
I think it would help.
how it's going? Okay. Can you make a note of that, Rob? Thank you.
That was excellent. Thank you very much. And so we'll move on to number 3, fundraising and capital campaign next steps. And Mike, take it away.
And this will be just a brief report. I provided just a one-page handout for the committee today. I spent a little bit of time between our last meeting and today just trying to survey the landscape to see who might be available in this space for fundraising consulting. We talked with David and Dave last week just about the need to get some assistance. If we were talking about shaping what a capital campaign might look like, these are just consultants that I've identified that have assisted with some of these smaller regional facilities, like Fargo. In the case of the first group, TRG, they assisted Des Moines with a performing arts center. And then there's some other museums and other art spaces that all three groups have been responsible for. We do have one group that does have an office in Minneapolis. I've not talked to the individual who is the principal at that office, but campaign counseling is really, and research is really the kind of primary work product of all three of these firms. They've provided examples and portfolios of their work. In terms of the city procurement policies and state law, what we would need to, I think, better understand is how they would work, and would we need to go out, if we were, and the city commission consented to, going out to engage this type of study work, how is that paid for? Would we have to bid it? Could we sole source something like this? We definitely need to perform some additional due diligence on it, but I think that these are three examples. There are several others, I am sure, as well as local resources that we've talked about previously that could assist with a capital campaign. But I think that in all cases, we would just really want to try better understand, as Kent just illustrated for us today, what our goals really are going to be. Because I think the thing that really struck us in talking to our financial advisor is that we need to understand the big picture, what I call the tectonic plates of big picture revenues before we would shape a debt profile and go and issue bonds because of some of the IRS requirements and some of the legal requirements. So if we had a goal, for example, and I'll just throw out a number of $20 million or $25 million to understand what that would look like and the impact on that debt service and that obligation first before engaging the financial advisor any further. So that's just some brief research. And then again, in this very brief discussion last week with Dave and David, we talked just about next steps of the task force, certainly defer to the chair, and how this is best conducted, moving from here to have some of these research discussions as well as some of these fundraising discussions. I know that it's a little bit challenging, around a big table to have some of these pretty preliminary discussions, but certainly defer to the group about how you'd want to proceed with that. But we're happy to kind of go to this next level and perform some due diligence on these consultant teams. And if there are others that folks are familiar with around the table, we certainly are interested in that, as well as the local resources. And then to the city commission, what we would do when we summarize the work of this task force is likely ask for some help in soliciting some fundraising assistance.
So can I ask Mike, so if it goes from this committee, because I think it's going to cost, we're going to have to spend some money for this, and so would it go to the commission, and then would we go out for an RFP? Is that kind of the next step that it would go?
Yeah, I think the thing I need to understand under the North Dakota law, and I don't know this answer today, is if one of these firms, for example, worked on a commission basis and only pulled in percentages of fees, off of dollars raised, what does that look like under North Dakota statutory scheme? I don't know the answer to that today. But then if others were just providing just professional services, much like an architect would or an engineer would, and you were just, soliciting directly for sole source proposals, we can do that to certain limits as per our purchasing policies in the city. But if these were very expensive consulting dollars, we would need to go out for a bid. But ultimately, the city commission will need to endorse and approve any additional consultant services.
So to me, the first thing I think we need assistance with is for them to assess what's the number that they think that our area can fundraise. I think that's the first thing. And ideally, wouldn't you want to have the same group doing the fundraising too? And I guess that's my open question. And there's people that have much more experience. And then I'll just give one more editorial comment. It's critical that we have a professional group doing this, because the amount of money that we're going to be requesting, the people that we're going to be asking get asked a lot. And you have to have everything very well done, or they're going to show you the door. And so we have to be very professional. And so that's why I think that we need to have somebody, this is their specialty. And I don't know if anybody, I'd love to hear other people's comments because there's much more. Go ahead, Brett.
Well, just one comment. And is it, in some of your models, you showed no additional fundraising, did you not? I mean, are you adamant that we need about 30%? I always thought we were going into this that we needed private dollars of 20 to
Yeah,
40%.
the only reason I put it in there is I haven't heard that from this group, and the city hasn't suggested we would do that. My goal was to say, if in fact the city commission decided to do that, this would be the financial implications of doing that. And in the case of one of the other peer groups, they chose to do it that way. So as we analyzed the data, we just thought, well, in fairness, let's just throw it all out there. Here's the gross, here's the buy down, and whatever level of fundraising that the commission is comfortable, and then the net debt payment that there would be a comfort level with, that's all yet to be decided.
So my question, Dave, is do you first determine our model that we have to come up with 25 million of donated funds, or do you come up with the other end, see what the wherewithal of the community is and fit that in? It seems to me we kind of need a model of how we're going to do this first.
Typically, these big campaign consultants, there are several steps, but one of the first steps is the feasibility study. So what they're talking about here, donor prospect research, and they will go out to the list of individuals or institutions that we give them. They'll put forward the plan, and they'll ask these potential donors if they think this looks reasonable, if they think this range of gifts sounds doable, what their potential gift might be. It's not a solicitation of a gift. And so they'll come back and they'll say, I think 15 is doable, I think 20 is out of your reach from what our research tells us, or whatever. Then when they come back in and you said, do you want the same, often it's good to stick with the same group because they've become that familiar with the community and with the project. Almost in all cases, they will not make the ask. They will help you set up the campaign, they will help train the community members, but this is going to have to be a committee of community members going out and making peer-to-peer asks. They're not going to do that part for us, almost in every case.
But they do, or they would co-op or help.
They would help, but I think we have to understand that this is, they facilitate the fundraising campaign, but they do not do it for us. I've never seen one that does.
So could I ask, and just Linda, in your experience then too, so that assessment piece though, that's a logical first step, is we would be contacting these individuals. We really
Right.
just need an assessment first. We're not asking you to stand up necessarily the framework with the to-do listing of who to call and who does what in that kind of calling tree, but rather just what the capacity is from a revenue standpoint of what they think is available.
Yep,
Is that
yep.
fair?
They're used to doing that, so we would show them our project, and we're using the number of 60 as a total amount. Let's say we're wondering if 20% or 50% is, which end of that is doable, and they will go out and do that assessment and come back and say, here's where we think you'll want to plot your numbers. And then that will give more information, and then structuring whatever financing pieces. And it's also going to make, as we found out with the library, it's also going to make a difference to prospective donors if it is a partially publicly funded city-owned entity, not a completely private one. Sometimes that makes it more challenging to raise money because, whether it's a largely publicly funded piece like the library or Blue Stem, it makes a difference with the donor motivation. We've also talked about naming, and that's also a big thing too. So the consultant will take all those things into consideration and will ask the donors how they feel about these different people in that initial study.
From my perspective, what I'd like us to do is go to the city commission next. I think that we should, and just say, whoever those guys are. Anyway, but I just think the good step would be to say, our committee, here's where we've gotten to at this point. And so at this point now, we need to see what is our potential for fundraising. Do you know what I mean? I think it'd be good for us to, we're kind of at that step. And then I do think, even though we don't know how much money it will be, it will at least then the city commission will be knowing where we are and that there's potential to spend some more money for this at this step. Does that make sense to everybody? Because I think we're, you know, at that point. And I do think that that's a critical thing to find out what is the potential, because I think that affects bonding and all that stuff. You know what I mean? I think that's our, kind of our next critical step. I don't know if everyone agrees. Jeff?
Well, I'm just curious, you know, where the city falls with this, and what is their capacity? What is their willingness and their capacity? Because I think we need to know, at least in some kind of parameter, where that might fall. I mean, we heard all the different options and the way you finance and everything else, but what's the reality, right? You're carrying a certain amount of debt, you can only go so far. If in fact this type of a project were to move forward, the city would be here, for example, at least in a ballpark. Because otherwise we're just kind of saying, well, what's the capacity of fundraising? And knowing that 100% fundraising private funds is probably not a reality. Okay, so, I mean, if I was a consultant coming in, that'd be the first question I'd have. Where's the city in their commitment to this at this point?
Well, and I would say just the ballpark number is 50%. That's kind of what we've been thinking of. That's
30 million, if it was a $60 million project.
And just to share my concerns when overseeing the entire operation, it would be more advantageous if we had a large fundraising goal and a dedicated revenue stream. Because all of our revenue streams are being, what's the word? They're not growing at a tremendous rate, and the budgets are becoming more challenging, and those issues are often consumed by our just general operation. So if we do have a new revenue stream, I think there'd be more willingness of the commission to move forward with that, as opposed to just launching a large debt payment into the budget and then trying to work it backwards. That will create a ripple effect on our operation. So I think it's fair to say that, because I believe that to be true.
And I would appreciate your position. But the bottom line is if there is not an additional revenue stream, then there is no additional revenue. So the city's in for zero.
Land.
Yeah, land, right off.
Yeah.
And so that puts us in a really tough spot. At
Yeah,
least
I don't
by
think we
simple
can
thinking.
raise $60 million.
No.
And I sort of thought, Dave, at our last meeting, we were going to put a small committee and kind of come up with a plan that said 30% private, 30% city, 30% lodging tax, and come up with a best formula, kind of with these other 10 venues that have done their funding, come up with a plan, and then, which I think we're ready to go to a group and say, what is our capacity? But shouldn't we have sort of a plan first on yes, what the city is going to do, what the city thinks they could do, probably with or without a vote? You know, and a vote of the public would be something. It scares me a little bit at the moment, but maybe you guys would think different. I don't know, if it was a smaller amount. But to come up with a vehicle, can't you do that with a small group?
Well, yeah, but I mean, the danger's in the details. The commission is the ultimate authority. I mean, we can come up with a variety of scenarios, but in the end, we'd run them up to the city commission, and they'll have to decide what's their contribution.
But I think that's what we've kind of been talking about. There's lots of options, and I think it's not just going to be one. I think it has to be multiple things, and that's a good thing. And we are kind of working about, there's a lot of moving parts with this, but I do think that finding out how much we can raise through donations, that's a big piece, and that will have a ripple effect on all those other ones. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, I agree with Jeff. I mean, I don't think you have to commit any money, but there ought to be some sense from the city of, the city's going to participate, whether it's 30 million, 40 million, whatever. So at least, because you're right, people are going to ask that question. I don't know how it would go over, if you said we have an ultimate fundraising goal of 20 million, which, with city participation at some level above that. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a consultant. I don't know how that works. You are. But I think you have to have some kind of, you have to be able to answer that question. Whether you have committed, and it's okay, I think, to say they have multiple potential funding options, but they're not going to pursue which ones they'll use until they determine how much fundraising is available in the community. But I think it would be, I think you almost have to throw out a number like $30 or $40 million as a assumed city contribution before, and no one's asking them for the money right now anyway. So the question is to find out if they'd be willing to. Kind of both are in, it's a dance, right? I mean, you're feeling each other out.
And so then my follow-up question to that is, where is the city with this project with regard to, does the city, speaking probably with the 5 commissioners, want to see this happen? Because otherwise we're just spinning our wheels, right? And so I don't think there's ever been any formal anything at a city commission meeting, a formal endorsement of anything with this? And if there hasn't been, should that be happening to then move forward with the next steps? Because otherwise we do all this work and then comes back and, no, we're not going to do this. So I don't know where that falls. I mean, I typically, speaking with boards, you get board approval to move forward to the next step, and the next step, and the next step, you come back, you're reporting, so that there is full engagement with the board, the elected group that's going to have to make the decision. So ultimately in the end. So I mean, that's just an open-ended question. I'm not sure where you guys fall with that structure.
Mr. Chairman, I believe this is always, whenever there's a large project like this, it's a delicate dance. And we've got to step into it to start to answer some of these questions. In my mind, if the City Commission approves going forward with some kind of consultant proposal, that indicates the next level of commitment. You can't expect 5 commissioners to commit to a project where they don't know the parameters of it either. So, you know, we just have to keep plodding along on this process, and that's the next logical step, it seems to me.
I would actually absolutely echo Arlette. You know, to answer your question, that's what we're doing now. When we build this kind of a process and momentum behind a project led by 2 commissioners, and you start reporting in on where we've gotten and the progress that we've made as a group and recommendations for the next step, absolutely the next step, the next chunk that the commission can bite off will be bringing a consultant, because we're ready to look at the fundraising piece. We've looked at all these separate pieces before, and I think that's a really significant bit of progress to be able to report. And what we're doing through all of this is not only building momentum for the 5 commissioners, but building momentum in the community conversations. And I think we're all experiencing, those are pretty positive, not in my own little bubble of my world, but I think the conversations in this community are so different than they were even 10 years ago. So absolutely, this next step will be a considerable one.
Yeah, Jeff, I think that we have, you know, and I'm making the assumption that Tony, Tim, and Tony have been appraised of these meetings and know what's going on, but I don't think we'd be still here if we didn't have kind of the push of the commission. So I think we do have that, and I think it's probably a good step to move forward. I think you sort of have a number, and that's where I think maybe you can work simultaneously, Kent, with a committee, because whether it's 10, 20, 30 million of privately raised funds, I think be prepared for any one of the above, but there's going to be a break point that if we can't raise X amount, we're probably done. And I've sort of got a figure in my mind. So I think it's going to be up to these private people to come forward, and if they don't, to a certain expectation, I think that kind of tells us the community isn't ready for it. And so we sort of need to grease those skids a little bit with those, and I think there's 20 people out there, at least, that could help with this. And if they decide that, yeah, we really don't need a performing arts center, then we're probably done, because, yeah, the smaller groups, me included, aren't going to get this done. They are going to get it done. And Jonathan, you're one to grease some skids back there. So I think that's a good step, and I think it's a good start. But I think in the meantime, you should, with Rob, Charlie, whoever you want to get with a finance group, have a plan ready at whatever stage of private dollars we are able to kind of bring in.
But once again, I don't foresee this being just, there's going to be two solutions where it's going to be some private donations in the city. It's going to be multiple things. I think there's going to be, a couple of things we have to clarify is the food and beverage thing. There's still some of these things that we have to get ironclad. And so all those things are going to combine to make the complete picture. And we're not there yet. And I do think this is the next step, like you were talking about. And I do think it's kind of a PR opportunity to tell the commission, here's where we are so far. And I do, what Kent and Mike brought with the other venues, that is a great thing because it shows us there's multiple ways. There's lots of people in our close area that are doing this, and so we can hopefully learn from them and use their best ideas. And so, Charlie.
Are you two commissioners comfortable going to the rest of the commission and saying we want to approve hiring this company to gauge the fundraising, just to see what's out there, but we need to have a ballpark figure to say that the city will have a contribution of somewhere in this vicinity, because we know that question's going to come up.
Yeah, but
they don't have to commit to a figure, but just to be able to say the city is going to participate somehow.
Well, of course the city is going to participate, but I don't think we need to, that isn't where we're at yet, to have a number from the city. I think we're comfortable saying, here's where we are, where we're going to have an evaluation of what we can raise for private funds. I think that's good. And I think, at the same time, I think we should talk about there's going to be other pieces to the puzzle. And it's not just going to be one, it's going to be a multitude of things. And I think by having small bites, that can add up to be very powerful. And the other thing is, I don't think it should just be for this Performing Arts Center. I think it should also be for the arts and start looking at other things. And that's part of it too. John.
I don't know where we're at as far as our appetite goes. I'd hate to see us go to the commission and come out with a 3-2 vote. It'd be nicer to have more buy-in from the commissioners that are questioning or doubtful. Commissioner Grinberg's expectation is we try to have a 50% private or other than public funding. And I don't want to lose his endorsement of us going at least into the beginnings of it. I don't know where Commissioner Gehrig would land or not, but so I don't know. I think we need to be practical though and budget this study, because we're in the budget cycle now, and that's a good test to volley that topic forward of including that in our current budgeting now, because we have to anyway, and that opens up the discussion. Charlie, I have a question for you that just helped me sort this out. From an outsider perspective in the community, people see us looking at needs and wants and goals and things I see the people out there weighing a convention center with a performing arts center. And I don't know they're at odds with each other. I don't know they're different. I don't know that I just don't know where the public sentiment will land with that. I don't know which is more profitable or viable for a community. But I think we have, at some point, we're going to get hit with that question pretty fast.
Yeah, well, my answer to that is, and I've talked to Dave and a few other people about this, and Rob and I have had extensive conversations about this. I think depending on what the funding mechanisms can possibly be cobbled together, I think we can achieve all of our aims. I think we can have a performing arts center, and I think we can add meeting space. We're not going to build a standalone convention center, but I think we can add significant meeting space at one or two locations, one of them potentially being the Fargo Dome. The key to getting the Fargo Dome enhancements done, additional meeting space, not a standalone convention center, too expensive right now, and a performing arts center is if nobody gets greedy, and from my standpoint, getting greedy for us would be, I want a standalone convention center. I'm not saying that. We need another 40,000 square feet added somewhere, or 45. And that would it would be immense help, and that doesn't cost nearly as much as a standalone. But I think, as Dave says, there are many different pieces to this puzzle, many different potential funding sources. I heard some ones that I hadn't even thought about today. And that's, my goal is to show everybody that I think if everyone gets behind these things, that we do need each of these things, we can make it happen if everyone understands that there are some limits to what you can spend. So I think it can all be done, but I would love to see a package proposal come forward for all of them at some point.
Pepcourt, I have a question for you.
now I'm getting nervous.
Well, we looked at many locations.
Someone else should be.
And we looked at different locations, and one of them was the Mid-America Steel location. People go, what a great location. Is it an idea where we take and we say the public owns that already, that we sell that out, put that on the market, and leverage that into an investment into this facility, which would be closer to the, City Hall? Is that a way of going to the public with this?
I think that gets kind of a complicated story to tell. I would hate to start dragging the whole Mid-America Steel concept into what we're talking about here. I think when we're talking about using different assets to leverage other assets, that's kind of in the weeds kind of talk. What we have done in this group is very methodically look at all these potential locations, and the one we picked makes the most sense. Mid-America's off the table. I think with the city, I think that's prime development.
That's what I mean, we sell it.
But what the city decides to do with that, I think is a separate conversation, because this is going to be complicated enough to talk about anyway, without starting to talk about asset trading and Mid-America Steel.
The best thing, so I really appreciate our group, and the thing that is the best about it is we have a lot of entities at the table that are all willing to work together instead of just saying, no, I'm just going to worry about my thing. You guys are on your own. And really, if you look around, there's lots of groups where they're all represented and we're all working together. And that's how we're going to get a lot more done. And everyone's not going to get it all done at the same time, but I think everyone's willing to give up a little if they know that in the long run. But the other thing is, we're a boom town, and the next 6 to 8 years, we're going to be even more of a boom town. And so that's why if we just keep working together, and I do agree, we have all these, the city has a lot of assets because of the flood protection. And so I think that'll be part of the financial puzzle too. But there's lots of things, and so I really appreciate you all. We just have a good group, and everyone's working together, and that's how we'll be successful. So that's.
Are we left that you're going to go to the commission and you're going to ask to fund this group? And can Kent start forming his group at the same time? Or do you not want to do that until this group is done?
Can I just interrupt, Brad? No, we got to keep this tight and not get too, so all we're going to do is go to the commission and say, are you willing to approve some for an RFP to have a fundraising group come in and assess what we can do? That's you got to just take. That's what we've been doing, very methodical. That's what we're going to work our way through. But when we do that, it's an opportunity for PR to say, here's where we are. And I will say, I've had lots of people asking questions about this that have lots of money. And that, to me, that's a good sign when people, they say, so what's the deal with the performing arts? How's that going? That's a good sign. And so I think if we just got to keep not getting too far ahead, and I think that we've done a good job, but that's kind of the next step.
Yeah, I agree, and you're right. And when we talk about these other things, and I do see the bigger picture that way, but I think Dave's 100% right. The next step for us is to get that study done as to how much money can be raised and for this project, because that's where the fundraising component would be. It wouldn't be anywhere else. So I agree. One thing at a time. We're just looking, some of us just have different things going on. So.
Bigger picture though, does that push us out 6 months, a year? Is it usually take a little time to do? No, I mean, I've not been a part of these, so.
I don't think it's that long. I think it's 1 or 2 months, and maybe but I think this is, we're making good progress, but this is, I'm telling you, this is, I said that the last couple of minutes, this is where the rubber meets the road. And I think this, it's the challenging part, and so we all got to stick together, and, but I'm telling you, we can do it. The time is right for our town. I mean, we have highly educated, young, and I think we talked about that, but we are losing money right now because people are going to events in Minneapolis that if we had this facility, they'd be going out to eat, they'd be staying here, and now we're losing, so it seems like we're not doing anything, but by doing nothing, we're losing money. And so I'm a little bit of a business guy, and that's the part that I think. Mike, do you want to wrap it up? Otherwise, I'm rambling. That's politicians for you.
Well, thank you for the great discussion here, and to Commissioner Pepcorn's point, we'll summarize some of the discussion today. We'll package that up for a future commission meeting when we have folks there, and we'll try aim for when I think we'll have 100% attendance at one of our upcoming meetings here. We've had some vacations in there, but we'll do that, and then we'll come back to this group. We don't have a future meeting scheduled at this time. This kind of wrapped this kind of chapter of the work for right now, but we'd be happy to get this group back together here later this summer before fall back to school kicks off, if that sounds agreeable. If folks want to just kind of hear how we did with the commission level, we can certainly do that. Defer to the group if they want to get together here in August or perhaps September.
So as I'm hearing it, this group is sending to the city commission, we will be, on behalf of this group, presenting an RFP to study the financial aspects of this project.
Yeah.
Fundraising, that's the RFP we're asking for.
Yep.
We won't know the costs until after we hear the RFP back.
Correct, either an RFP or sole source, and
don't
just
need to
direct
worry about-
solicitation. Yep, we'll figure that out legally, just about how we procure the service, but we'll just do some discovery phone calls with those firms that we've identified today. And then I would also add, again, I mentioned this earlier, if there are other either national or regional fundraising talents that people are aware of, I'm happy to also place phone calls there.
Anything else for the good of the order? Otherwise, thank everybody and have a good afternoon.